Grant's farm sits on 281 acres outside St. Louis. A French chateau stands at the top of a long drive, Clydesdale horses in the paddocks below it, and the gates have been thrown open to the public, free of charge, every spring since 1954. On a February morning in 1934, in an upstairs room of that same chateau, the man who ran the largest brewery in America put a revolver to himself. I have come back to this part of the story more than once, and the farm is always where I end up. For 100 years, the family that owned that farm was the closest thing St. Louis had to royalty. They owned the beer, they owned the baseball team, their name was on the stadium, and they opened their own estate to the city as if it were a public park. And across those same 100 years, more than one person died inside the family's orbit, in ways the law examined and then, each time, let go. A German immigrant who arrived at 18 with almost nothing built the largest beer company on earth, and 130 years later, his descendant sold it to a Belgian buyer for $52 billion. The man who carried the company through Prohibition shot himself in the family mansion and left an unsigned note that opened with a goodbye to his precious mommy. In 1983, a 22-year-old woman was thrown from the Heir's overturning Corvette on a curve outside Tucson, and the blood that might have shown whether he had been drinking was spun down and lost inside a hospital before anyone tested it. He was found hours later at home, dazed and bleeding with a fractured skull, said he could remember nothing, and was never charged. 2 years after that, police chased his Mercedes through St. Louis at 90 miles an hour and ended it by shooting out one of his tires, and a jury acquitted him. In 2008, he swore the company would never be sold while he ran it, and within months, he had signed it away and collected something like $100 million, a seat on the buyer's board, and a personal security team. In 2010, a 27-year-old woman died in his bed of a cocaine and oxycodone overdose, and the house waited roughly 40 minutes before anyone called for help. The prosecutor said the heir had refused to cooperate after the first day, called the search for where the drugs came from a dead end, and filed no charges. Every one of those things is in the public record. None of them, on its own, is the strangest part. This is the story of how a German immigrant's beer fortune became the closest thing St. Louis ever had to a royal family, and how that family sold the empire for $52 billion and walked away. It is also the story of what a fortune that size insulates, a separate kind of justice, in which two young women died 30 years apart, one in a wrecked car and one in a locked bedroom, and the heir at the center of both was investigated, settled with, and never once charged. I want to start at the gates of the farm, with the part everyone is invited to see, because the welcome is where the story hides. Before we go up the drive, one quick thing. If you subscribe, it helps build a community around these and rewards the work that goes into them, and it costs you nothing. Chapter 1. Grant's Farm. The land has a name older than the family. It is called Grant's Farm because Ulysses S. Grant once worked it, years before he was a general or a president, when he was a failing farmer who built a log cabin there by hand and named it, with no affection at all, Hardscrabble. The Bushes bought the ground around that cabin in 1903 and made it the seat of the family. There is a small irony in that, easy to miss. The most successful business family in the city built its monument on the ground where a future president had failed at farming, and named his own house after how hard the failing was. The Bushes kept the cabin. They turned the place of someone else's struggle into the showpiece of their success. And that turning, that ability to take a thing and make it mean what you need it to mean, runs through the whole story. What they built on it was a French country chateau, finished in 1913, with more than 24 rooms and 14 baths, set on its own private acres at the top of the property. Below it, they laid out paddocks and a deer park and, in time, the stables for the Clydesdales, the great draft horses that pull the beer wagon in the advertisements and that became, somewhere along the way, more famous than most of the people who owned them. For years, the grounds held what was said to be the largest private zoo in the world. Exotic animals from around the world, elephants and zebras among them, kept on a hillside in suburban Missouri, the kind of menagerie that European royalty used to keep to prove that the ordinary rules of nature did not quite apply to them. The family did not stop at the farm either. Their money and their name were on the things a city is built out of. The ballpark downtown carried the family name. They gave to the university and to the hospitals, funded a hall at Harvard that still bears the founder's name, and had been pillars of the great World's Fair the city threw in 1904. To grow up in St. Louis across most of the 20th century was to grow up surrounded by the family's name, on the good things, the beer and the team and the buildings and the horses. And then, in 1954, the family did something that fixed its place in the city for good. It opened the gates. Grant's Farm became a place you could take your children, free, to ride a tram through the deer park and watch the horses and feed the animals. And for generations of St. Louis families, that is exactly what they did. The estate of the richest family in town became one of the city's gifts to itself. You came through the gates, you boarded the tram, you rode out among the deer and the buffalo, you watched the great horses in their stalls, and at the end, there was a place to taste the beer. Children grew up on it. It was free, it was generous, and it was, in every detail, arranged. I want to be fair about what that meant, because it is easy to be cynical about it, and the cynicism would miss something true. The welcome was real. The family did employ much of the city. It did give it a baseball team, and a World Series, and a stadium with the family name on it. By the standards of American corporate dynasties, the Bushes were unusually woven into the daily life of the place they came from. St. Louis did not merely tolerate them, it loved them. But a thing built to be seen is also a thing that controls what is seen. An estate you open to the public is an estate whose gates you still own. You decide where the tram goes. You decide which acres are the public's and which stay private up the hill behind the trees where the chateau is. The welcome and the wall are the same gesture, made with the same hand. Because up the hill, in the private part, in an upstairs room of that chateau, the head of the company died on a February morning in 1934 with a gun in his hand. The public would be invited onto the lower acres 20 years later and would never be shown the room. That is the farm, a place built to be loved, arranged so that the loving stops exactly where the family wants it to. To understand how the ground came to hold all of that, you have to leave the farm and go back almost a century, to a German boy stepping off a boat at New Orleans, with the country still raw and young. Chapter 2. The Immigrant. Adolphus Busch was born near Mainz, in what was then the Grand Duchy of Hesse, in 1839, one of more than 20 children, near the bottom of a very long line. There was a family business in supplies, but there was not going to be much of it left for the second youngest of 20-some children, and in 1857, at 18, he did what hundreds of thousands of Germans were doing in those years. He left. The most reliable accounts have him landing at New Orleans and going up the Mississippi to St. Louis, though no ship is named, and the details of the crossing are mostly gone. St. Louis in those years was filling with Germans, and the Germans had brought their thirst with them. The city, had the two things lager brewing needed: the river for water and a band of limestone caves beneath the streets that stayed cold enough to store beer through the summer before anyone had refrigeration. Adolphus did not start as a brewer. He started as a wholesaler, selling supplies to the breweries, which meant he learned the whole trade from the outside before he ever owned a part of it. Then he married into it. On the 7th of March, 1861, he married Lily Anheuser, a daughter of a local brewer named Eberhard Anheuser, in a double wedding, his brother marrying her sister on the same day. Anheuser had recently bought a small, failing brewery to settle a debt, and it was not doing well. Adolphus bought his way in, and then he did the thing that made the fortune. He understood, earlier than almost anyone in America, that the future of beer was not in how it tasted, but in how far it could travel before it spoiled. He was among the first American brewers to pasteurize his beer so it would keep. He built fleets of refrigerated rail cars to move it across the country, and the companies to run the cars and the companies to ice them. He took a drink that had always been local, brewed and drunk within a few miles of the same spot, and he made it national. He built the supporting machine to do it, a refrigerator car company of his own in 1878, a private railway a few years later, the whole apparatus of moving cold beer owned end to end. By 1877, he was running dozens of refrigerated cars. The output tells the story by itself. The brewery made around 30,000 barrels in 1875, and more than 200,000 within 6 years, and it kept climbing from there. Budweiser, introduced in 1876, was sold as a premium beer, a national brand with a single consistent taste, the first beer meant to be the same in a saloon in Texas as in a saloon in New York. He guarded the name fiercely. He had secured the rights to the Budweiser name and defended it against anyone who reached for it, the opening move in a habit of brand control the company would keep for more than a century. By 1879, the company carried both their names, Anheuser-Busch, and after his father-in-law died, Adolphus ran all of it. There is one thing I keep returning to about the founder. The fortune was never really about the beer. By the standards of the brewers around him, his lager was good, but not magic. What he sold was cold and distance and rail, the machinery of getting a perishable thing to a continent of people before it went bad. He got rich on logistics dressed up as a drink, and that is a steadier kind of rich, because logistics does not go out of fashion the way a flavor can. When he died in 1913 on a visit to Germany, he left an estate valued at around $60 million, a sum some sources call the largest that had ever been probated in the state of Missouri. Then the First World War came, and the United States government, suspicious of a German fortune, scrutinized the estate under its alien property powers, and his widow Lily had to prove her loyalty to keep what her husband had built. The company passed to a son who would have to carry it through that same war against his own heritage, and then through a law that made his entire product illegal, and who, having survived both, would not survive what came after. If you have read this far, you probably already know whether these are for you. If they are, subscribe. It is free, and it is what keeps them coming. Chapter 3. Goodbye, Precious Mommy. The note was unsigned, and it opened with a goodbye to his precious mommy and his adorable children. The man who wrote it was August Busch Sr., the founder's son, who had run the company since his father died in 1913, and who had spent those years steering it through one impossible thing after another. First, the war, when being a German brewer in America meant being suspected twice over. German Americans were watched, their loyalty questioned, their language driven out of schools, and a company with a German name selling a German drink had every reason to be afraid. The Bushes leaned hard into proving their patriotism, buying war bonds, backing the war effort loudly, doing the work of showing a suspicious country that they belonged to it. Then the thing that should have ended it altogether. In 1920, the country outlawed his product. Prohibition took beer off the table for 13 years, and it killed most of the breweries in America. Anheuser-Busch survived by becoming, for a while, something other than a brewery. It made yeast and corn syrup and ice cream. It made truck bodies and refrigeration units. It made a malt beverage called Bevo and a line of soft drinks. It refitted the great plant to make corn products and refrigeration cabinets and the bodies of trucks and buses. The company turned itself inside out to stay alive without the one thing it existed to make. And most of those side businesses were quietly shut again the moment they were no longer needed. When beer became legal again on the 7th of April, 1933, a team of Clydesdales pulled a wagon through the streets carrying a symbolic first case, and the city celebrated as if a war had ended. The horses, brought out for that single day, became permanent. He had won. He had carried his father's company through the two events that should have destroyed it, the war and the dry years, and brought it out the other side intact, larger in some ways than it had been before. And less than a year later, he was a sick man. His heart was failing, his body was swollen with dropsy, his joints were ruined by gout, and he was in a kind of constant pain that the public record can only gesture at. On the 10th of February, 1934, less than a year after the celebration in the streets, he went to an upstairs room at Grant's farm and shot himself. He had outlasted the war and outlasted Prohibition, won the long fight to keep the company alive, and then, with the company finally safe and the beer flowing again, he ended his own life. The company he left behind was no small thing to have saved. It employed thousands of people in the city, anchored whole neighborhoods, and stood as the proof that a German family could build something permanent in America and hold it through anything the century threw at it. He had carried all of that to safety. Whatever it was that broke in him that February, it did not break for lack of having won. A St. Louis County coroner's jury sat, examined the death, and ruled it a suicide brought on by long illness. I find I slow down at two things here, and they sit oddly together. The first is the note, those few soft words at the top of it, a private tenderness left behind by a man the whole country knew as an industrialist. The second is the coroner's jury. There was a formal public mechanism, a panel of citizens convened to look hard at the death of the most powerful man in St. Louis and to say, on the record, what had happened to him. That is worth holding on to because it is the kind of scrutiny that the rich are usually able to avoid, and the family did not avoid it here. The irony, which only arrives much later, is that when other people died inside this family's orbit, decades on, no equivalent panel would ever sit to examine those deaths with anything like the same plainness. The company did not falter. It was bigger than any one man now, even the man whose name it carried. It passed first to an older son, who ran it for a dozen years and then died in office in the 1940s, and then to the younger brother, the one with the booming voice and the cavalry of horses, the one the whole city would come to call the Big Eagle. Within a single generation, he would make it the largest brewery in the world. Chapter 4. The Big Eagle. August Busch Jr. was the kind of man who is easier to describe in objects than in adjectives. The horses were his. The baseball team was his. The big voice, the 4 marriages, the 11 children, the cavalry boots he liked to wear, the stadium with the family name on it, all his. They called him Gussie, and around St. Louis they called him the Big Eagle, and for nearly 30 years he was the most visible private citizen in the city. He took over the company in 1946 after his older brother died, and he ran it the way he did everything, loudly and at scale. Under him, Anheuser-Busch became the largest brewery on earth by 1957. In 1953, he bought the St. Louis Cardinals for $3.75 million, partly to keep the team from leaving town, and partly because owning the city's baseball team was exactly the sort of thing Gussie Busch did. He put the company name on the ballpark, a new stadium downtown, and in 1964, his Cardinals won the World Series. By the early 1970s, the company was selling more than 25 million barrels of beer a year, and the man who poured it was throwing out first pitches and riding the wagon behind his own horses. He opened Grant's Farm to the public in 1954. He built the brand around the working man, the beer of the people who actually worked for a living. The advertisements told the laborer and the bricklayer and the line worker that this beer was for them, by name. And the message landed because the family really did seem to belong to the same world as the people it was selling to. When a cigarette company bought the rival brewer Miller in the 1970s and came after Anheuser-Busch with modern marketing, Gussie's company fought back hard. And the beer wars of that era were fought largely on the ground he had staked out, the idea that this was the honest American working man's beer. He made the family and the city feel, for a generation, like a single thing with a single set of interests. I want to take the affection seriously, because the deference that matters later grows directly out of it. The love was not manufactured. The jobs were real, tens of thousands of them. The team was real, and it won. The farm really was free, and families really did spend their Saturdays there. By the standards of the cold dynasties that ran most of American industry, the Bushes gave their city something back, visibly and constantly, and the city felt it. But that is also the root of the problem that comes later, and it is worth saying plainly even though it cuts against the warmth. A town that loves a family this much has a powerful reason not to look at it too closely. The newspaper that covers the family also covers the team the family owns, and depends on the family's advertising, and sits in the same town. The prosecutor who might one day weigh a charge against a Busch grew up, like everyone else in the county, with the horses and the stadium and the name. The closeness was real, and the closeness was a kind of insulation, and the two were never separable. The affection and the immunity were poured from the same tap. I want to mark that carefully now, at the top of the family tree, because it is the quiet engine of everything that comes later. None of what follows requires a conspiracy. It does not need a bribe or a phone call or a fixed case. It only needs a city, and a press, and a county full of officials who all grew up loving the same family, and who, when the hard moments came, found it a little easier to look away than to look straight at it. That is not corruption. It is something softer and harder to prove, and it works. Gussie ran the company until 1975. He did not retire, and he was not eased out gently. In the spring of 1975, he was removed, in a boardroom, in a vote, by a faction led by his own son, and he never fully forgave it. He kept the title of president of the Cardinals until he died in 1989 at 90, an old man in a stadium that still carried his name, riding the Clydesdales onto the field on opening day. The public face of a company his son now ran and he no longer controlled. He never got over the way it had been taken from him. The son who took it from him had been raised inside all of it, and had learned a lesson from it that his father never quite did. Hit subscribe if you want the next one. It costs nothing, and it takes a second. Chapter 5. Three Sticks. August Busch III was born in 1937, and the central fact of his life is that in 1975 he took the company away from his own father. He had been groomed for it and had still found his father in the way. He went to the University of Arizona and left without finishing, then trained seriously at the Siebel Institute, a brewing school in Chicago, learning the actual chemistry of the product in a way Gussie never had. He worked his way up through the breweries themselves, on the floor, in the laboratories, until he understood the making of the beer down to the molecule. He came up through the plants, and by the mid-1970s he had concluded, along with a faction of the board, that his father was running the company by instinct and ego in an era that demanded something colder. So he moved against him, and he won, and Gussie was out. The man they called Three Sticks ran Anheuser-Busch for the next quarter century as a different kind of operator entirely. Where his father had been all voice and appetite, the third was disciplined to the point of severity, a relentless student of marketing and quality and market share. He drove the company's share of the American beer market up and up, until close to one of every 2 beers sold in the United States was one of his. He spent enormous sums on advertising and demanded total control of the product, down to the freshness of the beer on the shelf. And it worked. The company had never been more dominant than it was under him. Around the industry, he became a kind of legend for his exactness. A man who was said to taste test the product constantly, who would call a distributor himself if a beer reached a shelf past its freshness date. He was good at the thing in a way that left very little room for anyone, including his own son, to be good enough. He was, by every account that survives, exacting, controlling, and almost impossible to please. He ran his family the way he ran the plants, by standards no one could quite meet. And the warmth that Gussie had carried so easily into a room was not in him. He divorced the mother of his son, Susan, when the boy was about 5, and the boy grew up shuttled between a hard, exacting father and the long shadow of the family name. I want to be careful not to turn this into pop psychology, because the record only supports so much, but the pattern is hard to miss, and it is the engine of everything that follows. A son had deposed his father in that boardroom. A generation earlier, the founder's line had passed through suicide. The men in this family took the company by being harder than the men before them, and they raised the next ones to be harder still. The founder built it. His son carried it and then ended himself. The Big Eagle made it the largest in the world and was thrown out by his own child. And somewhere in that machinery was a boy being measured against a father who was nearly impossible to satisfy. A boy who would one day be handed the whole inheritance and the whole weight of it at once. There was, beneath the dominance, a family that did not hold together well. 4 generations of coups and divorces and rivalries had left the Busches rich and fractured. A dynasty in name that did not move as one, and the people who would later study how the company was lost point to exactly that fracture as the opening. A family that trusted each other might have closed ranks when the buyers came. This one could not. By the early 2000s, the father had handed the chief executive's office not to his son, but to a company man named Patrick Stokes, the first person outside the family to run it in its modern history. A decision that said something about how much the father trusted the son with the thing he loved most. That father was cold and successful, and his control held the company together for 25 years. What it did to the boy is a separate question, and a harder one. And it is the question the rest of this story keeps circling. The boy was named August Busch IV. The first time the country heard his name attached to a death, he was 19 years old, and a young woman was lying in the wreck of his car on a curve outside Tucson. Chapter 6. The Fourth. The wreck was found at about 8:30 in the morning on a curve of East River Road outside Tucson that the locals called Dead Man's Curve. A Corvette had run off the road, rolled, and come to rest on its roof. The car was registered to the Busch family. The young woman thrown from it was already dead. Her name was Michelle Frederick. She was 22, a student at the University of Arizona who worked full-time at a nightclub in Tucson. She died of blunt force trauma to the head and chest, ejected from the car sometime in the early hours of the 13th of November, 1983. The wreck and her body lay on that curve in the dark for hours before anyone found them. August Busch IV was 19 years old, and he was not at the scene. Deputies found his wallet and his insurance card in the wreckage. Then they went looking for him, and found him hours later at his home on East Campbell Terrace, behind a door they had to force, dazed and bleeding, with what turned out to be a fractured skull. He told investigators he could not remember what had happened. By one account, he later said he thought he had fallen asleep at the roadside and been struck by another car, though the story shifted in the telling. It is worth being careful here, more careful than the story is usually told, because what is known and what is not are both part of it. What investigators concluded, from the circumstantial evidence, was that Busch had most likely been the one driving. What they could never establish was whether he had been impaired, because the evidence that would have answered it was destroyed before it could be tested. Blood and urine had been drawn at the hospital, but by the time a search warrant came through, the urine sample was gone, and the blood had been spun down into its components, which made testing it for alcohol or drugs impossible. No one was ever identified as responsible for losing it. The prosecutors were left to build a worst-case estimate of how much he might have had to drink, rather than a tested number, and even that worst case came out low. An autopsy reportedly found cocaine in Frederick's own system, although that detail comes second-hand and should be held loosely. The investigation was, by the county's own account, one of the most intensive traffic fatality investigations in its history. And on the 6th of July, 1984, the Pima County attorney declined to bring any charge at all. The reasoning was laid out plainly. There was adequate circumstantial evidence that Busch had been driving, but no evidence that he had been under the influence. A reconstruction put the car at something like 45 miles an hour, above the posted limit, but not on its own fast enough to support a charge of homicide. And even the worst-case estimate of the alcohol in his blood, built backward from how much he was said to have had to drink that night, came out below the legal threshold. The investigation had run for the better part of 8 months and ended with nothing that a prosecutor believed he could prove. The family declined to comment. A 22-year-old woman was dead, and the legal system, having looked as hard as it says it ever looked at anything, closed the file. It was not the last time the police dealt with him. 2 years later, in 1985, 2 plainclothes narcotics detectives in an unmarked car chased his Mercedes through the central west end of St. Louis at 85 to 90 miles an hour after his car nearly struck theirs. He was coming back from a club across the river. He stopped twice and sped off twice, and the detectives ended the chase by shooting out one of his rear tires. There was a handgun in his car. He was charged with assault on the theory that he had tried to run the officers down, and his defense was that he had feared the unmarked car held kidnappers, which for the heir to a fortune was not, on its face, an absurd thing to fear. In 1986, a St. Louis jury acquitted him. He was not yet 25, and he had already been at the center of a young woman's death, a high-speed chase, and a criminal trial, and he had come through every one of them without a conviction. Over the next 2 decades, he would become the marketing force inside the company, the man behind the talking frogs and the lizards, and a long, unbroken run of winning Super Bowl advertisements that topped the national rankings year after year. And then he would become the man who ran the whole thing, the fifth and last of his family who ever would. Subscribing is how stories like this keep reaching you. It is free, and it is the whole of the Ask. Chapter 7. On My Watch. In December of 2006, August Busch IV became chief executive of Anheuser-Busch, the fifth generation of his family to hold the office, and he said the thing the whole city wanted to hear. The company would not be sold on his watch. He had reached the top in the only currency the company truly respected, which was marketing. He was the man behind the frogs and the lizards, the animals that talked their way through the Super Bowl, the campaigns that won the national advertising rankings year after year after year. He understood the brand his great-great-grandfather had built better than he understood almost anything else. And for a stretch it looked as if instinct and charm might carry him. Then, in June of 2008, the offer came that the family had spent a century making possible, without ever quite believing it would arrive. InBev, the Belgian-Brazilian brewing giant run by a famously cost-disciplined executive named Carlos Brito, made an unsolicited bid for the entire company. The first number, on the 11th of June, was $65 a share, and the board rejected it later that month as financially inadequate. InBev did not go away. It moved instead toward what amounted to a hostile takeover, lining up enormous financing, preparing to put its offer directly to the shareholders, even moving to replace the company's board. The American company looked for a way out and could not find a better one. There was talk of buying the half of the Mexican brewer Modelo it did not already own to make itself too large and too expensive to swallow, and the talk went nowhere in time. Warren Buffett, one of the largest shareholders, was watching, and so in mid-July the two sides agreed, and the number was $70 a share. At $70, there was no honest way to keep calling it inadequate. The total came to $52 billion. The deal was run through a holding entity with a name almost no one remembers, and when it was finished, the merged company was called Anheuser-Busch InBev. In November, the shareholders approved it, and on the 18th, the deal closed. And Budweiser, the first national beer in America, the brand built around the American working man, belonged to a company headquartered in Belgium. Even August III, the father, the cold operator, who had spent 25 years making the company the most dominant brewer in the country, signed off on the deal. The family no longer held the votes to block it, and at $70 a share the price was beyond refusing. The one who had sworn the company would not be sold, the son, was overruled by the arithmetic and by his own father's signature. The thing the family had built across 5 generations changed hands in a matter of weeks. For St. Louis, it was a kind of bereavement. The new owners ran the company the way they ran their other companies, leanly. Within weeks of the close, they cut about 1,400 salaried jobs, the bulk of them at the St. Louis headquarters, and the loss of the sense that the brewery belonged to the place that made it followed close behind. The name stayed on the buildings, the Clydesdales stayed in the advertisements, but the thing those symbols had stood for, a family and a city bound into a single 100-year enterprise, was finished, and everyone in town understood that it was finished. The vow had lasted less than 2 years. That is not a sneer, because the truth underneath it is more interesting than simple hypocrisy. By the time the offer came, the family no longer owned anything close to a controlling share of the company. The reporting at the time put the share held by the elder Busch at roughly 1%. At $70 a share, the directors carried a legal duty to the shareholders that no amount of family sentiment could outweigh, and there is a real argument that the sale could not have been stopped by anyone, least of all a chief executive who had promised the impossible. But the shape of what happened can be stated plainly, without scoring it. The man who promised not to sell, sold, and was made very comfortable for it. What he received personally, by the company's own filings and the reporting around them, was a package worth something on the order of $100 million. He took a seat on the new company's board for a term of years. He took a consulting arrangement that paid him $120,000 a month, an arrangement that ran until the end of 2013, and he kept a personal security detail, provided and paid for by the company, into 2011. There is a quiet strangeness in that arrangement that is easy to walk past. The man who had sworn the company would never be sold was now, every month, being paid a substantial sum to advise the foreign company that had bought it, and to be kept safe by it. He had lost the family business and been made wealthy and protected by the loss, all at once. That is the part to set beside what came later. 2 years after he signed the company away, when a young woman stopped breathing in his house, the lawyers and the money and the private security were all still there, all still arranged around him. The full apparatus of a fortune that no longer brewed any beer, but still ran, very efficiently, the protection of the man at the center of it. Chapter 8. The House on Lindbergh. The house sat in the 2800 block of South Lindbergh Boulevard in Huntley, one of the small, wealthy enclaves west of St. Louis, policed by the neighboring town because Huntley is too small to police itself. It was a little over 6,000 square feet, with a 6-columned portico and about 16 rooms on roughly 4 wooded acres. When the police walked through the master bedroom, they described a scene that reads as its own kind of biography, full of electronics and weapons and energy drinks and protein shakes, with a loaded shotgun and a pistol hanging in the master bathroom. It was the bedroom of a man who felt he needed defending, kept like a small armory, behind a gate, behind a security detail. On the 19th of December, 2010, a 27-year-old woman named Adrienne Martin died in the bed in that room. She had grown up in the area, an aspiring model who did promotional and pageant work, and she had a young son named Blake, who was 8. She had been married to a doctor, an osteopath in Cape Girardeau named Dr. Kevin Martin, and was divorced from him not long before her death. It was through that world of events and promotions that she had crossed into the orbit of the most famous bachelor in St. Louis. She had been seeing Busch for somewhere between 1 and 2 years, depending on which account you take, and the accounts genuinely differ. Busch himself was not long out of a stay in rehab that he later acknowledged, for depression and what he called other issues. They were, by every description, a couple in a real relationship, not strangers, and her family understood them to be serious about each other. That is part of what makes the morning so hard to read. This was not a stranger who had wandered into the house. It was the man she had been seeing for a year or more, in the bed they shared, in a house kept behind a gate and a guard. By his own statement to police, he had woken beside her around 3 in the morning, found her groggy but awake, and gone back to sleep. He woke again around 1 in the afternoon, made 2 protein shakes and could not rouse her. He called out for help into the house. A household employee named Michael Jung was the one who picked up the phone and made the call to the emergency line. A little after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, more than 10 hours after Busch said he had last seen her awake. On the recording, he tells the dispatcher there is a woman who is just not waking up, that he does not know whether she is breathing. that it is dark in the back of the house. Paramedics arrived within minutes and worked on her and pronounced her dead at 26 minutes past 1 in the afternoon. By the time they reached her, she had been gone long enough that there was nothing to be done. The house around them was the one the police would soon catalog: the electronics and the energy drinks, the weapons in the bathroom, the gate at the road. A fortress that had kept everything out except the thing that had happened inside it. The investigators noted something in the timeline they could not fully close. There was a gap of roughly 40 minutes between the point at which she seems to have been found unresponsive and the moment anyone called for help. The exact minutes shift from source to source, and there is no pretending to a precision the record will not support. But the gap was real enough that the people working the case wrote it down and sat with it. Busch himself would later insist there had been no real delay at all, that the call went out almost at once. I keep stopping at the 2 protein shakes. It is the smallest detail in the entire file, and somehow the one that will not leave. A man wakes at 1 in the afternoon beside a woman he cannot wake, and at some point in the minutes that follow, 2 protein shakes get made. The ordinary morning gesture, and the dying woman in the bed, in the same room, in the same hour. The file does not tell you what to feel about it, and it is not this telling's place to tell you either. The detail is simply in there, and a person reads past it and stops at it, and reads past it and stops at it again. What the investigators found in that house, and what the prosecutor chose to do with all of it, is the center of the whole story. If you are still here this deep into it, you are exactly who these are made for. Subscribe, and they keep coming. Chapter 9. A Dead End. The medical examiner for St. Louis County was a respected forensic pathologist named Dr. Mary Case, and her finding was specific. The manner of Adrian Martin's death was accidental. The cause was oxycodone intoxication. There was also cocaine in her body, at what the prosecutor would call a separately lethal level. The cocaine taken within about an hour of her death, and the oxycodone within 5 or 6 hours. And both drugs, the prosecutor said, she had taken voluntarily. The scene held the rest of the picture. A medical investigator found a short straw with white residue in the pocket of Martin's hooded sweatshirt. That straw was then returned to the pocket, and it left with her body when it went to the funeral home, and it was never examined again. A second straw, with cocaine residue, was found elsewhere in the bedroom. There were empty pill bottles bearing Martin's name, one with oxycodone residue and one with cocaine residue, and neither she nor Busch had a prescription for the oxycodone. An examination of her body found a perforation of the nasal septum, consistent with months, perhaps as much as a year, of cocaine use. Investigators looked for a medical record to support the heart condition her former husband said he had once diagnosed in her, and could not find one. In February of 2011, the St. Louis County prosecuting attorney announced that no charges would be filed. The prosecutor was a long-serving and politically formidable man named Robert McCullough, who had held the office for decades, and was about as established a figure as the county's legal world contained. A man with no apparent need to fear anyone, and no obvious reason to do a wealthy family any favors, which is part of why the decision has never stopped drawing argument. It was clearly an accidental overdose, he said. The drugs had not dropped out of the sky, he said, but the investigation into where they came from had reached a dead end. His office had examined whether the death could support a charge of manslaughter and had concluded that it could not because Martin had taken the drugs herself. And he added one more thing, on the record, that has hung over the case ever since. He said that Mr. Busch had refused to cooperate after his initial statement on the day she died. Busch's lawyer had notified the police in January that his client would make no further statements. From the start, That lawyer had said there was absolutely nothing suspicious about the death, that it was the tragic and untimely passing of a young person. Here, exactness matters more than anywhere else in the story, because this is the place where a thing like this goes wrong. No one has ever produced evidence of a tie between Robert McCulloch and the Busch family, financial, personal, or otherwise, and I am not going to invent one. The decision not to charge may well have been the correct reading of a genuinely hard case. A voluntary overdose by an adult is not, in most hands, a homicide, and a prosecutor who charges a case he cannot prove does no one any good. The argument here is not a deal, and it is not corruption, and the story does not need either to land. It rests on the documented shape of the outcome, set beside the prosecutor's own words. 2 separately lethal drugs. Paraphernalia in her pocket and in the bedroom. Unprescribed pills in the dead woman's name. A delay before the call for help. And the only living person who had been in that bed, who answered questions for a single day and then, through his lawyer, stopped. Set that same set of facts in a rented duplex on the other side of the county with a man whose name is not Busch, and ask honestly whether the surviving partner who went silent in a house holding unprescribed narcotics and a dead body walks away without so much as a charge to defend against. By the 2010s, prosecutors across the country were increasingly willing to bring manslaughter or drug death charges against the person who was present when a companion fatally overdosed, especially where there were drugs at the scene and a delay in calling for help. People with no money and no name were going to prison on exactly that theory, in exactly those years, for deaths with fewer unanswered questions than this one carried. The claim of this story is not that the law was bent for him. It is narrower and harder to wave away. The law, looking directly at him, found a dead end in exactly the place where, for people without his name, it has so often found a defendant. Martin's family did not simply accept the closed file. Her mother hired a prominent New York attorney named John Q. Kelly, a lawyer who had represented the estate of Nicole Brown Simpson and the family of Natalie Holloway. The kind of counsel a family brings in precisely when it believes the ordinary machinery has failed it. He pressed. He raised the gap in the timeline, the silence after the first day, the unanswered question of where the drugs had come from. And still, against a prosecutor who had already called it a dead end, none of it produced a criminal charge. The only forum that ever required anything of him at all was a civil court. And what a civil court can require is not an answer. It is a number. Chapter 10. What the Law Saw. The wrongful death suit was brought on behalf of Blake, Adrian Martin's young son. It never reached a trial. An early figure of $1.5 million was reported in the spring of 2011, and then, on the 30th of October 2012, in a courtroom in Cape Girardeau, the case was settled in full for $1.75 million, with no admission of negligence by Busch or anyone else. The largest share, about $1.33 million, was placed in trust for the boy who had lost his mother. Her parents received $200,000 each, one share placed in an annuity for the grandson. Busch's lawyer said it was not an admission of fault, that his client cared deeply for Adrian's son, and that everyone was glad to see a long and bitter dispute end. $1.75 million. Set it beside the roughly $100 million that Busch had taken out of the sale of the company 2 years before, and the whole arithmetic of the thing sits in 2 numbers. The death of a young woman in his bed cost him, in the end, something close to 1/50th of what he was paid for breaking a promise about a brewery. and it cost him no admission of fault at all. 2 women were dead, one in a wrecked car outside Tucson in 1983, one in a bed in Huntley in 2010, 27 years apart. In neither case was August Busch IV ever charged with anything. In the first, the evidence that might have decided it was lost inside a hospital. In the second, the prosecutor called the search for the truth a dead end and closed the file. A columnist at the St. Louis paper put the public reading of it as plainly as anyone could, writing that the case was one more reminder that the rich really are different from the rest of us, and that an ordinary person standing where Busch stood might not have been treated the same way. The company is gone now, to Belgium. The Cardinals were sold long ago, and the family that had moved as one thing for a century stopped moving as one thing at all. When the question came of what to do with Grant's farm, the family fought over it, bitterly and in public. The local zoo offered close to $27 million for the land. One of the Busch brothers countered with a bid of $26,001 and more for the mansion, just to keep it in the family. By 2017, 5 members of the family had agreed to hold on to the one piece of the empire that was never really a business. They kept the farm. Step back now from all of it, because the chronology is finished. It would be easy to end this by saying the heir got away with murder. And that is not what this is, because nothing in the record supports it, and the truth is both smaller and worse. No court ever found that he killed anyone, because no court was ever asked to. That is the whole point. This is not the story of a crime that was hidden. It is the story of the machinery that meant the question of a crime was twice, quietly set down before anyone had to pick it up and answer it. What strikes me, after the time I have spent with the 2 files and the 1 estate, is how little force it actually took. There was no grand conspiracy. There was a lost vial in one hospital and a closed file in one prosecutor's office decades apart, and around both of them a fortune so deeply woven into its city that looking away was simply the path of least resistance for everyone except the dead. The insulation was never a wall that anyone set out to build. It was the shape the whole world took on its own, around that much money. What survived is the name, the farm, the foundations, the fortune, the brand still selling in nearly every country on Earth. What did not survive is harder to lay out, because it left so little behind to hold. A 22-year-old who worked nights at a Tucson club to put herself through school. A 27-year-old mother with a young son. 2 women who are remembered now, when they are remembered at all, mostly as the women who died near a man whose name they never carried. Grant's farm is still there, on its 281 acres outside St. Louis. The gates still open to the public every spring, free, the way they have since 1954. The Clydesdales still come out of the stables for the crowds. Children still ride the tram out through the deer park, and at the top of the long drive, the chateau still stands, private, up the hill, behind the trees, where the public is welcomed exactly as far as the family decided long ago that the public would be welcomed, and not one step past it. 2 women died 30 years apart, one in a car and one in a bed, and the law looked at both of them and charged no one. This is what these are for. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.